Thank you for your singing. Thank you. I think Fijians are some of the best singers in the world, so it's beautiful to be here among you today. Thank you, Reverend Wilfred, for welcoming me and being open to talk about these type of topics in church, because they're not always easy. They're not stuff we talk about often. I am a pastor back in Australia, in the city of Toowoomba, which is near Brisbane. I've been a pastor there for over 20 years now. And also I started a ministry that works with women and girls. We help a lot of abused women and girls in our city. We run a pregnancy support centre. We run rehab for women and drugs. We help the refugees. We work with the sex workers in our brothels and strip clubs. So we work together as women across the churches, trying to make our city a better place. So I'm just going to start. I want to talk for a few minutes this morning about disrupting darkness. Is there any darkness in Fiji? There's a bit, isn't there? There's a lot. But let me start off with a story about a group of people called the One-Way Missionaries. You may have heard of them. And I'll just read the story out of the book. It says, a century ago, a band of brave souls became known as the One-Way Missionaries. They purchased single tickets to the mission field without the return half. And instead of suitcases, they packed their few earthly belongings into coffins. As they sailed out of port, they waved goodbye to everyone they loved, everything they knew. They knew they would never return home. A.W. Milne was one of those missionaries, and he set sail for the New Hebrides in the South Pacific, knowing full well that the headhunters who lived there had martyred every missionary before him. I wouldn't want to go. But it says, Milne did not fear for his life because he had already died to himself. His coffin was packed. For 35 years he lived among the tribe and he loved them. When he died, tribe members buried him in the middle of their village, and this is what they wrote on his tombstone. It said, when he came, there was no light, but when he left, there was no darkness. You know, that's our role as Christians, is to make the cities, the villages, our homes more light. The Bible says that Christ is the light of the world, but he lives in us. His light lives in us, and so therefore wherever we go, there should be light as well, shouldn't there? And darkness only prevails because light is absent, because maybe we've become silent, we've become comfortable, we've run away from the darkness. But Jesus wants us to disrupt darkness. Sometimes we think of the word disruption as a negative word, but today I want to make it a positive word. We are to be disruptive Christians, disrupting darkness. So let me just share a bit of what I'm doing here in Fiji. I'm here for 2 weeks at the moment. When I was 14 years old, living in Australia, my father walked into my bedroom and said, we're moving to Fiji. And I thought, I don't want to move to Fiji. I loved being in Australia. I loved my friends. I'd never been to Fiji. It was another culture, it was different. But we packed up our home, not in our coffins, we put it in suitcases. And we flew over to Fiji and settled in Nassori. We lived down Vuthi Road in Nassori. And I was 14 and my parents wanted to enrol me in a school. They enrolled me in the international school. But then as they were driving back to Nassori along the Princess Road, they saw another school called Untitled School. And they drove up there. They thought it was a hospital. So they drove down to the school and out came Miss Nyanga, the principal, and they told her that they have a daughter, and Miss Nyanga said, we would like her at ACS. So they took me out of international into ACS, and there's my class photo. Can you see which one I am? It's not too hard, is it? I'm the white one. And that was my Form 3T in 1990. I was just there for 1 year, but it was the best year of my life. I loved being there with the Fijian girls, learning, laughing. We played hockey, and still today I keep in touch with a lot of those girls. We had breakfast at my place yesterday morning, which was lovely. So I was just here for 1 year. I went back to Australia and graduated, and then I became a pastor in my city. And in 2019, one of those women in that photo, in my class photo, she contacted me because she had seen on social media the work I was doing with young women, the work I was doing around pornography, and they invited me to come back and speak and do a women's session here in Suva. So I did, and it was great to reconnect with everyone. It was great to go back to ACS and speak to all the girls there. I love being with them. The uniform's still the same, which is beautiful. But as I was here and I was catching up with friends and engaging with different groups, I always knew that the abuse of women and pornography was a big issue. But for some reason in the Pacific Islands, it's ginormous. It's this cloud of darkness that just covers. In fact, the international statistics on abuse of women is 1 in 3 women are abused around the world. But when it comes to the Pacific Islands, 2 in 3 women are abused. And the boys, the little boys, let's not forget, it's the children as well, many boys. And I'm aware that even today, sitting here, some of you have your own stories, your own journeys, whether you've been a victim, whether you've been a perpetrator. This is not a message of condemnation, because Jesus Christ has died for those things, hasn't he? He's died to bring us freedom, he's died to bring us hope, to bring us healing, and so today we live in the light of the cross of Jesus Christ to set us free from shame. And then in return we are called to disrupt this darkness. So I started to re-engage back in Fiji, and I felt God just breaking my heart in a new way and giving me a new love for Fiji, for the people of Fiji, especially the broken, the vulnerable. And so the last time I was here in 2020, right before COVID, I returned back to Australia and I wanted to write a book because I realised again these issues around abuse, we still are very silent. The church is very silent, and we need to disrupt the darkness. So I found I was able to engage with 10 Fijian women. Some are here in Fiji, some now live in Australia, New Zealand, and I got them to write their stories, and we put together this little book, The Disruptive Voices of Fijian Women, and that's why I've come back to speak about this book here. I have some copies if people would like some copies today. Why did we write this book? Because we want to give the women a voice. And what shocked me when I came back in 2019 is that so many of these women were just voiceless. I said, why aren't you speaking up? The Bible tells us to speak up for the voiceless, doesn't it? Speak up for the broken. And quite often the response was, it's not cultural. It's not part of our Fijian culture, is it, to speak about these things? But I said it's part of God's culture. God never wants us to be silent in the face of evil. In fact, on the back of the book I've said to be silent in the face of evil is more evil than the evil itself. So when we are aware of these things happening in our families or in our villages, if we remain silent, it's actually more evil than the abuse. We're actually a part of the problem. And the church has been silent in my nation and in your nation. And instead of being part of the solution and bringing light and hope, we've been part of the problem. And I just say, God, forgive us. Forgive us that we have not been your voice. Forgive us that we have not been your hands and feet. So I wanted to give these women a voice, and it was amazing that as many of them wrote out their stories for the first time, they said it brought healing into their life. Because being able to get out the pain actually brings out healing. You know, when you have a sore, you want to get the pus out, don't you? Because if it stays in, it becomes a bigger sore. And I was talking to a beautiful woman yesterday who works with cancer survivors. And she talked about how quite often when we're silent about the abuse in our life, it brings cancer. Did you know that? Silence. And so she said we can't be silent because it continues to spread. Now, not everyone who has cancer has been abused. but it's amazing how many have, and how the silence then manifests out in their body. So we want to break the silence. And then I want to remind us, the church, the people of God, that the abuse and the issue of pornography, it's evil, and we have a responsibility to do something. We have a responsibility. It's part of God's plan for us. I want to tell you a story about a woman in the Bible, a lady called Rizpah. We don't hear about Rizpah very much. In fact, I've never heard anyone preach on Rizpah, but I've started preaching about her. Her story is in 2 Samuel. And just to give you some background, David was king, and there was a drought in the land. And David asked the Lord, why is there a drought? Why is it not raining? And God spoke to David and said, because many years ago there was a war between King Saul and a group of people called the Gibeonites. There was bloodshed. And so David went to the Gibeonites and he said to them, I've just asked the Lord why we're in a drought, because we need rain. And the Lord has showed me that it was because of the war that happened between you and King Saul. And David asked the Gibeonites, what can we do? How can we reverse this? We need rain. And the Gibeonites said to David, give us 7 of Saul's sons. Because we all know that Saul had many wives, didn't he? Many children. So David went and he got 5 sons from a woman called Merab and 2 from Rizpah. And he took these 7 sons and gave them to the Gibeonites, and they murdered them. And then they hung their bodies, as you'll see in that picture. They hung them up at night. And instead of bringing the bodies down at nightfall, they left them up there. The culture of the day was to bring the bodies down, but they left them up there. And Rizpah, this mother, she went and stood underneath these dead bodies because the wild birds were going to come and eat out their eyes. The beasts were going to destroy their bodies, and so Rizpah wanted these young men to have dignity in death. And she didn't just stand outside their dead bodies for a few days or a few weeks. For 6 months. For 6 months she camped, she isolated under these dead bodies in great risk, great sacrifice to keep away these wild beasts. Also, she wanted her community to know that what had happened to these boys was not right. It was evil. It was unjust. There could have been another way to sort out the issue. And so she was reminding the community by being out there day after day after day. This was unjust. And you know, sometimes when you see people doing things that are a bit weird, you're like, I wish they would just go away. I'm sure there were people in the community thinking, Rizpah, these bodies are dead. Just leave them, go away. It smells. And I'm sure even today there might be people in Fiji, and I know there's people in my own city that think, I wish Letitia would just be quiet. We don't need this issue at church on a Sunday morning. Let's just keep it under the rug. I receive death threats in my city because I speak out so much about pornography, and people think, I wish she would just go away. But part of the role of the church is to remind the community of the injustice, of the oppression, of the evil. That's part of our role. We are to be Rizpahs, men and women, and not go away until there is change. And so Rizpah did not go away until King David took the bodies down. And then it rained. Then it rained. And so may we be Rizpahs, may we speak up. So may we be ones who disrupt silence. We are called to disrupt silence when there's evil, to speak up. I had a beautiful woman, a Fijian woman who lives in Brisbane. She called me up the other day. I'd never met her. She had heard about the book and what I was doing. And she said, I was abused by my sister's sons many, many years ago. And to this day, the poor woman has never even told her sister. She's carrying around, and she just wept and wept and wept on the phone. My heart broke for her. And when I left Fiji 2 years ago, I thought, even if these women don't feel like they can speak up, I can use my voice to speak up. Maybe not everyone feels like, maybe your story is still too painful and you can't speak up. But together there are people who can speak up. I want to tell you another story in the Bible. This is Amnon and Tamar, two of David's children. And you probably heard this story. Amnon was sick one day and he asked his father, "Please send Tamar over to give me breakfast." Amnon was actually in love with his sister. Again, more evil. And David ordered Tamar to go and give him breakfast. She wasn't given a choice. She had no voice in her family, like so many others. And she went over and she gave him breakfast, and Amnon grabbed her and raped her. It's a tragic story. And then he discarded her. And the Bible talks about her walking around the streets with ashes on her head, crying out. Can you imagine if every young girl and boy who has been raped in Suva was walking around the streets? I've got a feeling the streets might be full. I've got a feeling. So the tragedy of this story is not just that Tamar got raped, but when King David found out, he was silent. The Bible says he was angry, but he didn't comfort Tamar. He didn't deal with Amnon. He didn't bring justice. He was silent. And then what ended up happening, the other brother Absalom killed Amnon. And that's what happens usually, isn't it? When we keep it silent, anger and oppression, it's going to come out somewhere in our families. It's going to come out in our communities. It always does. And so we must disrupt silence. And many of you are probably aware, and we hear these statistics from the Fiji Crisis Centre, and as I said before, the high rate, but it's a shame. It's huge darkness that in our nation, over 72% of Fijian women have faced some form of violence in their life. So we need to know that domestic abuse, it always thrives where there's silence, where there is silence. And I've been working out in my city. I live in a city of 150,000 people. Our statistics would say 1 in 4 women and girls are abused, and I've worked with hundreds and thousands in the last 20 years. And I'm always asking God, how do we bring healing? How do we bring healing to these young girls? And a couple of years ago, in 2017, there was a big worldwide movement called Me Too. It started in Hollywood by a woman, an actress who had been abused, and she just wrote her story of abuse on Twitter and wrote the hashtag #MeToo, and she encouraged women all over the world, victims, to write their story on social media. And I remember just watching for several days, woman after woman, and some men writing their stories. And I thought to myself, I want to bring these people together. I just don't want to read their stories on the internet. These are human beings. And so I did this Facebook post. You probably can't read it, but I hired out a cafe in the middle of our town, and I said on this Facebook post, if you have been a victim of abuse, of rape, of violence, come to this cafe on this day. It was International Women's Day, March 5th. Come to this cafe and share your story. And I didn't know if anyone would come. I was scared. It was a big risk. But sometimes we've got to take risks, you know. Disrupting always requires risks. It always requires stepping out. So I put this post up on Facebook, and that evening 40 women from our community turned up. Women who had never come into church. You know, have you noticed that people just don't come running into church anymore? I think maybe because they know that we're judgmental, we're a bit religious, we're going to be critical, we talk. Fiji's so small, isn't it? Everyone's somebody's cousin, I've worked out, in this country. And so these women came, and we just gave them room to share their stories of abuse. I'd invited some of my good Christian friends, my Christian women, and for about 2.5 hours we sat there and listened to story after story after story. And it wasn't nice. It didn't make me feel good. But something powerful happens when the people of God listen to the pain of a city. You know, that's part of our role. And I love that in the Bible there's the book of Lamentations. Lament. Lament means to cry out. You know, so much of the Psalms is David going, God, help me. God, I'm suffering. I can't bear this. And so in the book of Lamentations, it's a story about the city of Jerusalem that had been decimated by the Babylonians. Mothers were eating their children. That's how devastating it was. And so God allows this book of 5 chapters of lament and crying out. And there is so much pain in people's lives, and we don't want to listen to it. We just want to hear the good stuff, don't we? You know, the amount of times I go to churches and the pastor says, who has a good testimony? Who wants to tell us something good that God has done? And that's important, but maybe sometimes we need to leave room to hear the lament and hear the pain and allow that cry to come up to Jesus. Because God hears the cry of the brokenhearted, doesn't he? And so that night, we had a powerful night as we just listened. And every time a woman shared, I had a Christian woman stand up and say, thank you. Just acknowledge. Thank you for your courage. We've heard you. Your story is important because you know what? So many times when girls and women are abused, and one of my friends, I'm not sure if she's here today, Mele, she's chapter 5. We've changed their names, but she's happy to be identified. She's chapter 5, Naomi. Her story was that she went to the next door neighbours for a sleepover with her friend, and the friend's father came and abused her in the night. And he said, don't you tell anyone or I will kill you. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl and being told, if you tell anyone, I will kill you. And so she carried that silence for years until she saw my Facebook post saying, any Fijian women want to share their stories. And so it's important that we allow the voice of the suffering in a non-judgmental way, in a way that releases forgiveness. Another thing I did that night was I had a man, and I love that we've got so many men here this morning. I had a man just sit outside the door, and he's a great-grandfather in our city, a very godly man. His name is John, and I said, John, if it's appropriate, can you please come in at the end of hearing the women share and just apologise. Just stand in the gap and apologise on behalf of men who have caused pain, abuse, rejection. Even though he wasn't the one who caused it, the Bible talks about standing in the gap. That's something we can do as Christians. Stand in the gap and release the Father heart of God. And so we were having such an amazing night, and I sent John a text and I said, okay, John, we need you to come in. And he walked into the room full of these women. He was weeping because he had sat outside the door and heard all their stories. And he just felt the love of Jesus for these women. And he stood up and apologised, saying, sorry, as a man, I want to apologise for the things that have happened, what's been done to you. And these women just wept and wept. It was such a powerful time. And so I want to say to the men here today, we need you. And maybe you have been part of the problem in the past. Well, there's forgiveness. Repent. Confess. But get your life back on track and be part of the solution and not the problem. Fiji needs good men. We need men who don't walk in power and control. Being the head of the home is not a position of power and control. It's a position of love, servanthood and sacrifice. That's what Ephesians 5:25, it says, love your wife as Christ loved the church. What did Christ do for the church? He died. And I have an amazing father, and he always says, my job is to make sure my family flourishes. He's got 5 children, 15 grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren. And he's been an amazing man, married to one woman for 55 years. And he has served and sacrificed and acted like Jesus to us. That's the role of men in society. And I know that's not very cultural. This man is a pastor. He's a Fijian pastor in Australia. And when the book came out last year, because the borders weren't open and I couldn't come over here, I started travelling to all the Fijian communities in Australia. I spoke to 14 different communities, releasing the book. And when I was in one city last year, this pastor, Pastor Atama, at the end, he got up at the end of my presentation that was a bit like this, he actually stood up in front of everyone and he pointed at me and said, "I hated that presentation." I was a bit shocked. Usually people say thank you and they at least pretend to be nice. But I appreciated his honesty. He said, "I hated that presentation because I used to abuse women." He said, "I used to abuse them. I've confessed and I've repented and I've turned away." He said, "All I ever wanted was my 3 beautiful daughters not to be abused, but they all married abusers. One had her jaw broken, she has a metal plate." And so he stood up and just looked at the women and apologised. He apologised on behalf as a Fijian man. And again, it was so powerful. I love it that God is raising up humble men, willing to be vulnerable. This is the Bible. Jesus was vulnerable, humble, a servant, a speaker of truth, wasn't he? And so I want to call us this morning to disrupt silence. Oh. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the issue of porn as I finish. And again, this is a big issue. And in my city, because I've been working with so many abused girls, I remember one day a few years ago reading in our local newspaper, the #1 abuser in our nation is not a stranger, it's someone living in the home of the girls and the women. It's usually someone who might even say, "I love you." But it's because they're watching pornography and then they want to act out what they're seeing on a human being. And so I love helping the vulnerable, I love helping those who have been abused, but I want to get to the root of what is causing it. And I became aware that pornography was fueling so much violence against women. The rape, the incest. And so when we watch porn, we're actually saying yes to violence against women. You know, it's easy in our city, we have a lot of men who stand up against violence against women, but I actually don't want them to stand up and speak out if they're watching pornography, because that's just as bad. You're funding, you're part of an industry that is destroying the lives of not just women, but men as well. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, actually, pornography now is just so readily available. Our children, we all have access. If we've got a phone, we have the world's biggest porn site. In the olden days, you had to go into a shop and buy a magazine and sneak home and try and watch it. But these days, you can just watch pornography everywhere. And so much now of it is filmed. And so 88% of pornography alone is violence against women. In Australia and in Fiji, it's the #1 sex educator because we are silent around the issues of sex. You know, God created sex. It's beautiful. But the enemy has taken it and distorted it. And so what our young people are learning in pornography is that sex is all about violence, domination, putting women down, pulling their hair, choking. I won't say too much more because I see we have young people, but it is awful. And our young people are seeing pornography around the age of 8 to 11. Because the porn industry knows how to get in front of our young people. They might not be searching it out, but porn is predatory. And the other fact is that now 1 in 3 visitors to porn sites are females. And another brave woman in this book shares about her addiction. A Fijian young woman shares about her addiction to pornography. It's so readily available, the world's #1 porn site, which I won't mention, but every year they release their statistics. At the end of 2019, this one porn website had 42 billion visits in 1 year, 150 million per day. That's 80,000 visits per minute. And not only that, but you can actually film your own pornography and upload it to this porn site. And what we're finding out now, and we have a lot of court cases, it's good, we're beginning to go after them. Because women find that they were raped and it was filmed and it's put up on this porn site. I mean, if you're watching porn, you could be watching a crime. And there's no regulations, nothing. And this is available for our children. Our children are 2 clicks away from this material. And it's their little brains, it's distorting their brains. And this is why we have a huge issue. Our paper last year in the Australian reported Slapped and choked, boys imitate porn. You know, choking and slapping and violence is a big part of pornography. Hardcore porn is inspiring boys to commit violent sexual acts on their peers. With schoolgirls being choked, slapped and forced into unwanted sex. This is what our young people are having to deal with today. Back in my day, we might have thought it was great if we hold hands. Today it's choking and slapping. And I hear this firsthand from teenagers in my city. And so in our city, with our campaign, we've called it a city free from porn. And I want to bring light into the darkness. I want to help educate a city on what pornography is doing. No one speaks about it. It's all swept under the carpet, but a lot of people are watching it inside the church, outside the church. So we've been doing billboards in our city. And I look at the billboards in Suva and I think, I wonder if we could do a billboard in Suva. To help bring awareness, we have our website, and then back on our website there's all the facts, there's local people, there's where to get help, support groups. We do community breakfasts. The mayor of our city is very on board with us. The police, school principals, because the school principals see day in and day out the effects that pornography is having. In fact, I spoke at a school here in 2020 in Fiji, and the principal said, "I'm so glad you're here to speak about pornography." She said, "I know our children are watching it because their grades are going down." And did you know that research shows that pornography actually kills your brain cells? It kills your brain cells. And I thought that was very observant. So in 2020, myself and Linda Tamboya, my ACS schoolmate, we launched Fiji Free from Porn. It was one night down at the Butt Street. This man here, Navatiko, some of you might know him, great man. He used to work in the Suva prison, and he used to interview all the sex offenders, and he said, "Letitia, 100% of sex offenders are addicted to porn." 100%. So there's a link. We had a great crowd. You know, every time I come to Fiji, I read the Fiji Times and I see story after story. Why are grandfathers raping their granddaughters? Why is that happening? Why could something so sick happen? Only because of pornography. It's in the church. You know, this week, even in the Fiji Times again, another pastor abusing boys. There's story after story. Fiji rates 4th highest in the world for Googling porn. 4th highest. God help us. There's some darkness to disrupt. So it was great. When we launched, the media picked it up. We were able to help educate. I was able to go to schools, get on TV, help get the message out, go to rugby clubs, speak to parents, and just get the word out there, hey. I'm going to end there because my time is up. But may God help us, hey. I'm not here to judge or point the finger. I'm just here to say, church, can we do better? I'm working on this in my own city. These are big problems in Australia. But for some reason, even in a beautiful little country like Fiji, it is destroying the soul of your nation. And unless the church rises up and says, we want to be a part of the solution, we are going to disrupt silence, we are going to be humble, we are going to be honest, we are going to seek forgiveness. We need to step in, hey, and disrupt the darkness. I pray that when we leave this earth, that Suva will have experienced the light of Jesus Christ because of the church here. Let me pray. Father, I thank you this morning. I thank you for these people. I thank you for this church. Lord, forgive us where we've been silent. Forgive us when we've been part of the problem and not the solution. Father, I thank you that you love Fiji. You love Fiji. You've given it your church, your people. But Lord, may we be active. May we run with the light of Jesus in our hearts, disrupting darkness. And so I pray, let your courage come upon your people today. Let courage rise. May we be like Rizpah, that stands up, takes action until, Lord, things begin to change, until we see the Spirit of God released. May we get ourselves informed. May we be a church that doesn't judge or throw stones, but may we be a safe place where those who are struggling with pornography and abuse can come and find help and security and love. not judgment, not religion, but love. And so, Jesus, do that in our hearts, I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Letitia. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you once again. It is a very important presentation. These are hidden things that are here all over the nation and globally, but needs to be addressed. And I know that the church is the conscience of society. And thank you for sharing with us. Dapat ni binata boleh pun nabi kai wasia ni sini bala butal ngana kau nama iba conclude takakina. Rondol cin kalima ciku merut kanta boleh busa untuk posa balik pun na ulutang gua be renang wani. Ciku merut kanta boleh busa out mai indo na statistics mai na Google ni obiti ciku na cini na matin tu bura-bura ko rendo type taka na Google na pon kava bura-bura ke matai ciku Papua New Guinea keni kava obiti go indo na ka binaka ti me barita ki bole tongo so na kanga anda na numatu ni sindo tu na ka au posto go ya una state of mind pakanga me sanga ndo tu na ka tin santa pa talibon tu normal nga nangangandri ni tamata normal nga na tamata ni tu nangangandri ngon gai tiko na daga ni butumbuto menreta ya meso merli baka dengu ya na non sarabatunga so sale dikte sarkina ba barita ka chiko kwa so sale chiki sartunga ni non rombulo ne beisinga mera viasar Kongo obostingo be kwa na dorbo ngone lewa be kena turanga talanga kena maram sensara indui tau bata sarang na bonua indo lago kina na bana nanu kena bonua e vangole kina nelo na nisa available to be barita ka chiko o be barita ka chiko ni sibina ni ko na kena bimbi be kenta mentando reida pa bola kai ni na baka sama ni lotu siang walanga ni kena lo rai tau kona kena saranga sin lo rai kona kena saranga ko o baba na tonga kona baka sama ni nomu intimate relationship with the Lord. How do you guard that ngamarro e bagada ni warau ni nomu be kai ni betikena kelu ena so saranga ka ndondo mo sa tiga bu sacrifice tango mbiuta lai baba ka chichi tu sartu ngaki na nandam bol dua kona kena mbasiga medalincinga na no message kina ndona itukutuku vaka suka bina ka tumai vaka chocolate bina ka tumai ngeo bina ka tamo paista katal ko ya sulia chiku mai ka chiku mau ko ya toranga ni tukutuku ngori vande wa paista katal sanga ituiki ana no mundingi ba ndua na lotu ba Kristo ibe na bonua itukina no mo bana nanu ena no mo bekan ki chisu kina baro wase na kakasio baro sa kau mai abi be ba suka ba chocolate tel tu mai dada libo tel tu mai so sa sing nimberanga eso eta wiligochi e toranga bango sa na kokon sa chikini no nombulo tunga na bakan deo tegi tukutu iyo ya saranga na kai mbole na numbulo ne bising it challenges na lomu bekan ki chisu ke ongai be mai yang chukui tumba rei bina ka chukui tumba o yang raba chuko kenelama be yau na nungu rei do yau e tau doko sota baka bina kaya na baka sama ni nombe bandin tinta Yesus. Kuni mainda itumba, kuni itumba don tamani lasu lia pun tatap cui itumba. When in the very in a nomulo manilongi na bonua indon me marro kino ko ako bonom bimbi. Na nomu be akan ki Yesu o boli taka baka raw tunga batani sini chigobe ko na kena yalondina ni lo manyo kwa. O bina kata mutini na baka sambimbingo en singbina ni kwa. May present nga o Letitia Ukilani don't we can because we are in influencing places. O kenda tongo e lima sanga bulu kava na undolu na nondo to follows in Facebook sar juga sibina ni kwa. Nondo to tambangone they can influence other youths. Rchigongo na ngasini bully, rchigongo na buni wai, rchigongo level nondo to parliament, rchigongo people who can influence others. So it is important that we talk about this more openly. Au ini tu bala sing do bun takatali. Tu guna saranga bon do. Ke baka obien kata mo kila kau tamana telefoni ni lube mun dolaban telefoni lagu na Google history raida kina ndona ponsai dere chokosan. That is how I do it at home. My chicken in on the Henry baki, chicken on tudu. But I'm matingo, Mongo to maybe Tano Takachuna level on my centenary. In a matingo Namatisa coach me bolongo, Virna Dombuchiro. Matapata. Tunga maybe Vitano Takachungo. We're so Sarah Matioch, I was at Tal again do a Naitokani, Vital Sa Matiochi. Go elo rei le sartunga ni takatunga orto le bisigo ngani sona ilala maram orto reni o ko eveli chike na laptop orto mani basu suku talmai orto manduana bosani I vai ndona ndo vuna ulau ni sar tu na o chini manduana nuka betike bana buntenga meda kisana ngai nda buni takasumbu kita susa chiki ni nonda bi vai rachi tala noa Vai chikubi ko nangau nani kuai ndu na ndraki nimbulo kila ndendre molang maikina if you are currently in a state where you are addicted to this itu na bibuke o Letitia ko ndona ndau ni counseling na chikinongo e utalanga so talene ke baka ni ko na turanga raningiri mai email mai message mai how can I go about taltala in addressing this issue we need to talk about it ke baka isanga we are in a sick society when out there society is sick because a sick church produces sick society. But when we have a healthy church that talks about things that needs to talk about, we will have a healthy society and a healthy city. So we need to stand up. This is why God has placed this church here. City mission, then we need to address it. Usa cinangan itu tunggu. Sakit nangon namuni reda mai namuni uni reda muni bulida na daba na internet na daba na kamuni rani bosa. Dondo bira namuni baba ko sana ndu tambuni bular cigin. Kabia undona ital talanga singo undona nonra retreat in service. Tunu bango ko ya. Usa ruceu tunga ko kiana tamba-tamba ngabango. Wakara wakala ngabango. Au tugene ni ba. Rauci ku tunga ngori. Boleh ndu mekani matamba-tamba merah bulida ira na bingarabi. How to address this issue. But things and the changes need to happen. Kasi hindi may bata tao. Saro chiku tunga katambatamungod, yan may sato sunga dakadak. Then may bata tao tu, kaya napakararamatay kinakama baleta na nanda. O sa nita kanin nabibugabi kaya nalakalu. Kana sulo abi kaya indo na ibaraw niya longganga may bagay tuloy chuka. Let us be disruptive. I be tu nabi matanggalin ragi nimbula kita ngatungo. Let our voice disrupt na daka-daka kita nga nimbutung-buto kaya na daka-daka nibunila. Talk about it more, share it, address it, preach about it. Kaya na nandaw bunaw, preach about it. Kaya na liabo nga, kaya na baka mandu atagi ka expose tayo kaya na daka-daka nimbutung-buto kaya na bunila. Kaya na yata sa kanikalun na taman na kinalumian kaya na utambong. Wandi tagi kaya na chiko na kalun hindi na raramin na bose, wrong way kaya na kaya na matarabi na.